We're on DAF Kuf Beis Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. We were talking about this nagar, which is a peg, a metal peg that you use to lock the door by sticking it into usually the threshold has a hole in it. You stick it into a hole in the threshold and it locks the door. We learned yesterday that it's only okay when you have a glustera, when you have some kind of knob at the end of it, which indicates that it's a kli, in which case you're demonstrating that it's not meant for construction, but rather it's its own independent utensil. And therefore it looks less like bona, and therefore there's more of a reason to be matir. And also, according to some opinions, that it has to be nital ba'ogdo, it has to be attached with a string that's sturdy, such that if you grab it, it's not going to fall away. We're continuing along in this discussion, and here it seems like Rashi explains that it is there is no glustera on the peg that we're discussing in this Mishnah, and also that the string that attaches to it is sufficiently long, and so therefore it's more problematic to use this nagar than the nagar that we were discussing in the previous Mishnah. So nagar hanigrar, so this is a nagar that drags. It basically is, it's got a long string attaching to it. I didn't wish you mazel tov yet, Danny. Mazel tov on the chasana. You have a peg that drags on the ground because the string is long. It is attached, it is tethered, but it's a long string. So no'alin bo b'mikdash, you're allowed to use this peg to lock the door if there's a door in the Beis HaMikdash that needs to be locked for sacrificial purposes, because there's no rabbinic prohibitions in place in the Beis HaMikdash when it comes to sacrificial needs. Avalo b'medina, but you're not allowed to do this anywhere outside the Beis HaMikdash because it has a similarity to binyan, to construction, and therefore it's prohibited. V'hamunach kan v'kan aser. But if it's not tethered at all, it's not that it's just dragging on the floor from a string, but it's mamish not attached at all, and it's just there in a corner, so then even in the Beis HaMikdash it's asur, because according to the Tanakama, then it really is an act of bona. There's no knob at the end of this peg. This peg is actually, you're adding to a structure on Shabbos, and therefore even in the Beis HaMikdash, it's going to be an isur d'oraisa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer hamunach muter b'mikdash v'hanigrar b'medina. Rabbi Yehuda is more liberal, and he says even if it's not attached, you're allowed to do it in the Beis HaMikdash. At most, it's only an isur d'Rabbanan. And if it's dragging, but it's still tethered by a string to the door, so then it's muter even lechatchila, even when there's no knob on top of this peg. So the Gemara now says, Tanu Rabbanan, Ezehu nagar hanigrar, shenoalin b'mikdash avalo b'medina. So the Brisa just clarifies, what kind of peg are we dealing with, such that the Mishnah had said, according to the Tanakama, you're only allowed to use it when it's dragging by a string. You're only allowed to use it in the Beis HaMikdash where there's no isur d'Rabbanans, but you are not allowed to use it outside. So kol shekasher v'toloi v'rosha echad magiya la'aretz. As long as it is tethered properly to the door, one end of it is suspended because the string is sufficiently taut, but the other end is dragging on the ground. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af zeh b'medina mutar. And Rabbi Yehuda says, I disagree. I hold that that's even, in that situation that you've just described, then it's permitted, even lechatchila, outside the Beis HaMikdash. Ela ezehu nagar shenolin b'mikdash avalo b'medina. But what kind of peg may only be used in the Beis HaMikdash and not outside? Kol she'eino lo kosher v'lo talui v'shamto menicho b'keren zavis. It's not tied, it's not tethered, it's not suspended at all, and it's just freestanding, and you leave it in a corner and you pick it up when you need it. That's an issue where we would not permit it outside the Beis HaMikdash, but in the Beis HaMikdash it's permitted because it's only an isur d'Rabbanan. Amar of Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha k'Rebbi Yehuda b'nigrar, that the halacha is only like Rabbi Yehuda when it's tethered. Meaning that what he's saying is that I hold when it's not tethered, there's actually a boina midioraisa, but when it's tethered, then even in the Medina, even outside the Beis HaMikdash, it's muter lechatchila to use it, because there it's clearly not bona at all. Amar Rava v'hu shekasher b'delis, and Rava says, but that's provided that the tether attaches the peg directly to the door and not to any side structure that accompanies the door, like the door frame or anything around the door. It's got to be mamish attached to the door itself to demonstrate that it's part of the door structure. Eini, is this really so? v'lo amar lahu v'lo midi. There was once a case where Rabbi Tavla came to the city of Mechuzah. He saw that the peg was tethered not to the door itself, but to one of the, I believe it's one of the cross beams of the door. Is that how they translate it? The Ibra Dedasha was the cross beam of the door, not the door itself. And he still said that it's permitted, even though it's not tethered to the actual door itself. So how was he able to do that according to Rava? The Gemara answers, Hahu nitol be'igdo hava. So now we have to go back to our previous Mishnah from yesterday. There, the tether was so strong, it was a very thick rope, and it was very clearly demonstrated that it is part of the structure of the door system, and therefore, since when you pull it, it could not be, the rope could never be broken, it was a very sturdy rope, there the Chachamim permitted, even when it's attached not to the door itself, but to the accoutrements of the door frame, or any other thing around the door. Rav Ivya Iklul Naharda, he once came to Naharda, Chazyalahu Gavra Davaka Katir Begami. And he noticed that there was a man who was tying the peg using a piece of long grass, which means that it was a very flimsy kind of tether. And Amar Dain Lo Nitrok. And he said to him, he says, that's not going to work. The language of Nitrok is a Zelo Yinol. He says, you can't use this to lock the door. Why? Because it's as if it's this piece of grass, it'll just snap off immediately as soon as you pick it up and pull it a little bit. And therefore, he says, that's considered to be like it's just lying on the floor. Boy Rabbi Zera Nikmaz Mahu. Rabbi Zera now asks an interesting question. He says, what happens if instead of when you insert the peg, you insert it into the threshold and it remains above ground? So there's less of an indication that you're doing an act of bona. Because remember, bona, at least according to most opinions, is only prohibited when it's done in a structure that is attached to the ground. So clearly there's less of the appearance of bona when you're inserting a peg that remains above ground. Here we're asking a question, what if by inserting the peg actually goes into the ground as well? Will that be permitted or not? Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand. Don't all the pegs have to go in but remain a little bit up to secure the door?
Yes, they go up, they stay up, but usually there's a threshold, which the threshold is a little bit elevated above the ground. Just like in any door, you have a threshold.
Yeah.
So the standard way of doing it is to put the peg into the threshold, drill a hole into the threshold and stick the peg there,
Okay.
but the peg remains above ground even at the bottom. Here, you're drilling a hole into the ground, and the peg will go down deeper and still act as your lock. So that's the question. Amar of Yosef, Maiti Boile. So he says, what's your question? Lo Shemiyah Hadetanya Nishmat Asr Nikmaz Mutter. He says there's a Beferish Braisa that says that if it's not tethered at all, it's Asr, but if it goes into the ground, so then it's Mutter. The Rabbi Yehuda Amar Nikmaz Afal Pishenu Nishmat Asr. And Rabbi Yehuda, actually surprisingly, is more machmir over here, and he says that even though I hold that many times it doesn't have to be a strong tether, and I hold, you're right, he says, but nevertheless I hold that nikmaz, even if afal pi she'eino nishmat, even if it's tethered, it's still going to be usher, because he says that looks too much like an act of bona. The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha ka Rabbi Yehuda b'nikmaz, and Shmuel had said that halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda in a case of nikmaz when it bores into the ground. And v'taimamai, what's the reason? Amar Rabbi mishum demechzi kabona, because there it looks like you're doing more of an act of construction. So therefore, the final upshot is that if the peg goes into the ground, it's going to be usher, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who's more liberal.
What's nishmat?
Nishmat, it means it's not tethered at all. It's not attached at all to anything. Okay.
The fact that the thing would not hold the door if it's not going in the threshold, Tamiko.
What's that?
The peg would not close the door properly if the peg does not go in a little in the threshold.
It has to go into the threshold. The question is, does it go below the threshold into the ground? That's the issue that we're discussing here. Ba'amine Rav Nechumi bar Zachariah me'abaya, asalo beis yad mahu. What would happen if you have this peg that is not tethered at all, and you created a handle for it? You made some kind of grip for it to show that you want to make it into a kli, sort of like the issue that we had before, where you have a knob at the end, right? So he says, Amar lei buchna ka'amart. He says, in that situation, you've created a real kli that is like a mortar, for a mortar and a pestle. And so, as a result, he says, even if it's not tethered at all, then it's considered okay. It doesn't look like bona anymore. Itmar Amar Rav Nechumi bar Ada asalo beis yad mutter. And the same thing was said by Rav Nechumi bar Ada. Hahu sharisa dahava be Rebbe pedas dahumadu la be asara v'shadu le adasha v'lo amar lehu v'lo midi. He says there was once this very, very large beam that was used as a stock to lock a door. You know what I mean by a stock, right? You know, lock, stock, and barrel, right? So this was the stock that is used to, you put it over the door with the metal bars to hold it, and it was used to lock the door. But this was a very, very heavy beam. It was could only be carried by 10 men. But he still said it was okay. He felt that when he saw people do this, locking it on Shabbos, he felt it was okay. Why? Amar Taurus Kli Alav. He said, Aleha. He said, because it has the status of a Kli, just like we learned before by the peg that has the din of a Kli. It doesn't look like bona anymore because it's used for that purpose, and it's not a construction material, but rather it's a utensil. Hahi Asisa, Dahavas Bei Mar Shmuel, Dahava Machzekes Aderiva, Shara Mar Shmuel Lemishdaye Yadasha, Amar Taurus Kli Aleha. There was a certain kind of container called an Asisa. It's a very large container that held a half of a sa'a of material. So it was very, very large. A half of a core, 15 sa'a, I should say. And it was very large, and they wanted to prop it up against the door to act as a door jamb. And Mar Shmuel permitted it because, he said again, it's a kli, it's not a construction material, and therefore it's not a problem. Shalach le Rami bar Yecheskel Rav Amram Nemal on Mar mehalein mili ma'aliyasa de amartlon mishmei de Rav Asi bekipi de arba. He says, do us a favor, Rebbe, send us back a shir on some virtuous things that you've been quoted as saying regarding something called kipi de arba. Now, an arba is a boat, and kipi are loops that they would loop over the boat. Now, why would you do it? So imagine a stagecoach. How do they make a stagecoach? They put canvas over a frame. So it's a metal frame of loops that you loop over the boat, okay? Large circular loops. And you put canvas over that to create sort of like a covering for your boat. And the question that was being asked is, on Shabbos, are you allowed to, if you just have the frame, are you allowed to put the canvas over, or is it a problem of creating an ohel? Right? So, Shalach le hachi amar Rav Asi hani kipi da arba bisman sheish behen tefach inami ein bem tefach vein ben zelazeh shlosha lamocher mebi machatzelos uparis aleihem. So he said as follows. He says, I can give you two leniencies. One of two leniencies to allow you to cover the boat on Shabbos with the canvas. Either one is the boat is still partially covered, at least the tefach. So then by extending it, you're only adding to an existing ohel, so that's okay. Another leniency would be is if the loops are spaced within 3 tefachim of each other, in which case you already have a pre-existent covering, so by adding the canvas, you're only adding to a pre-existent ohel. In both of those cases, he says, my time, why is it permitted? Mosef al ohel arayu v'shaper dami. He says, because in both of those cases, you're only adding on to a pre-existing temporary covering, meaning that it's meant to be placed on and removed regularly, with regularity, like opening an umbrella that is fixed into the ground, which according to many poskim is okay, like a sun umbrella that's embedded into the ground, or rolling a canopy that's already partially unfurled and continuing to unroll it. This is really what we're talking about.
Why is that okay?
Because it's an ohel arai. It's meant to be constantly moved, opened and closed, and it's already partially pre-existent. It's already partially covering. So you have both of those factors, and therefore you can be lenient. Hanahu dechari dahabulela Rav Huna. He said there were goats that belonged to Rav Huna, and he was in charge of taking care of them. To be a mama bo'utula during the daytime, it was hot and they needed shade, so he wanted to unfurl a covering over them during the day. Uvalelia bo avira, but during the nighttime they needed air, so he wanted to uncover it. So asa lakami derav armalei zil kroch budya v'shayir batefach So Rab said to him, he says, the solution is that it should be there should be a canopy that's already partially covered, at least a tefach that's still covering the area. So when you add on to it, you're only adding to a pre-existent ohel. Lamachar pashta umosif, and he says, therefore you can go ahead tomorrow and finish unfurling it, umosif al ohel arayu, at v'shaper dami, and therefore you're only adding to a temporary ohel, and therefore it's perfectly fine. Amarav mishum Rabbi Chia vilon mutar lenatosa umutar leparko b'Shabbos. Rabbi Chia says that you're allowed to hang a curtain over a doorway and remove a curtain over a doorway on Shabbos. He says because that's not really setting up an ohel, that's just done for privacy. And like Rashi explains, it's not something that's meant to be fixed there, that it's meant to be put on and taken off with regularity, and therefore there's no problem at all. Kilas chasanim. Now you have a bed that has a canopy over it. That canopy is called a kilas chasanim. And typically the way that they would make this canopy is not with 4 posts like you and I are used to seeing in a bed, but rather there were 2 posts, one at the head of the bed and one at the foot of the bed, and you would make an overhang that was an A-frame that would go over the bed, and then you would secure it to both sides of the bed, so you'd have this triangular A-frame kind of covering.
Like what a pup tent is called.
A pup tent, good, right, exactly. So the question is, are you allowed to set this up? Are you allowed to put the canopy up on Shabbos? So mutar leparka ulanatosa b'Shabbos, you're allowed to undo it. I'm sorry, you're allowed to undo it and you're allowed to pitch it on Shabbos. And Amr of Sheshis Bereder Rav Idi lo Amran elo she'ein begaga tefach. But that's only true if the top of the canopy does not have a horizontal width of 1 tefach on top. I mean, it's got to come to a point. If it has a horizontal top of 1 tefach or more, so then it's too much like creating an ohel, and therefore it's going to be aser. And furthermore, lo amran ela she'ein bepachos mishlosha samach legag tefach. Aval yesh bepachos mishlosha samach legag tefach aser. I'll give you another chumrah, and that is that even if it comes to a point at the very top, but it flares out so wide, this A, right, that by going down even within 3 tefachim of the point on top, you get a flare that is wider than 1 tefach, so then you already have, using the principle of lavud, it's considered to be as if the top of it also has a horizontal point of 1 tefach wide, because it's within 3 tefachim of the very top. And therefore it'll still be usher if it flares out at that angle, such that before you hit 3 tefachim from the top, you're already flared out 1 tefach. And now I'm going to give you a third chumrah. V'chi ein bepachos mishlosha samach legag tefach nami lo amran ela she'ein b'shipua tefach. Aval yesh b'shipua tefach shipuei ohalim ka ohalim dami. The third chumrah, which sounds really bizarre, is that even if it flares out so narrowly, such that like when you go down 3 tefachim, you still haven't gotten to 1 tefach wide, but if by the time you get to the bottom of the bed, where the mattress is, you have a space that flares out 1 tefach in each direction from the center, so you've got 2 tefachim of width on the bed itself, where you secure the 2 sides of the tent, of the canopy, so then that's also going to be usher, and the reason is because shipuei ohalim ka ohalim dami, that the point where you measure from the center point of the top of the ohel, that also has the status of an ohel itself as well. So wherever the tent ends is also going to be considered to be part of the tent structure, and if you have using the imaginary center point of this tent 1 tefach in either direction, is going to be problematic. Now, of course, you're saying to yourself, that's a pretty narrow bed. I guess if you're a chassan, maybe you could. I'm not sure. But it sounds outlandish to replace this requirement, because then it's impossible to ever have such a heichatimtza. That's what Rashi's problem is. And therefore, Rashi explains that what we're dealing with is not one singular A-frame tent, but rather you set up multiple posts on either end of the bed. 1 post is higher, the other 2 posts are lower. then another 2 posts are higher, another 2 posts are lower. So you have zigzagging posts, and each post creates its own little A-frame on top, and then instead of going all the way down in the middle, they connect at the top. So here you've created multiple A-frames like this. You see the picture in Rashi, right? And you only wrap around on the sides a piece of fabric on all sides, which creates that enclosure. And there, what the Gemara is saying is that if you create the imaginary line going down from the edges of where the bottom part of the letter A that each one of these posts creates, if you have a width of 2 tfachim at the base of that A, so then it's going to be a problem. So you have to make sure that there's less than 2 tfachim at the bottom of each one of these things, and then it's considered to be okay to set it up on Shabbos. V'amar Rav Shisha b'reder Rav Idi Sayan Ashari. He further said that it's okay to wear a hat, like a borsalino, which has a brim. You're allowed to wear that on Shabbos. I v'hatanya aser. But there's a brisa that says that it's aser to wear a borsalino on Shabbos. So lo kasha hada is beitefach hada les beitefach. The answer is that it depends how wide the brim is. If the brim is 1 tefach wide, like those yeshiva bachrim where the hat is bigger than them, right? You ever see, you know what I'm talking about? You see the little bar mitzvah boy, he can barely get his head up above the lectern.
It's a walking hat.
And there's a walking hat. He's like like Darth Helmet from, if you remember that movie, right? Where the hat is bigger than the kid, right? So that's where it becomes a problem, where the hat is so big, right? So the Gemara now says, but elameata sharviv biglime tefach hachanami da'aser. But frek the Gemara, but what about a guy who puts, according to what you're arguing, anytime the brim is a tefach wide or larger, it's a problem. What about the fact that when you have a talis over your head, sometimes, and we're not just necessarily talking about a prayer shawl, we're talking about any time a person puts a shawl over his head, sometimes it could be a piece of fabric hanging forward from your forehead that's wider than a tefach. People do it all the time when they're davening. You put the thing over your head, and sometimes the talis goes past your forehead more than a tefach. What?
Especially having the Torah on.
The Torah sticks out, exactly. So you're going to tell me that you can't do that? So elalo kasha hada mihadek hadalo mihadek. The answer is, says the Gemara, the reconciliation is not so much whether it's a tefach or not a tefach. In all cases, it's okay. The concern is not the creation of an ohel. That's not what we're talking about. The concern here is that it's going to blow off, and you're going to be tempted to carry it in Rishus Harabim. That's the issue of why you're not allowed to wear that hat. So if you live in a community with an eruv, so get a brim as wide as you like, it's no problem. The only issue is when you're living in a community where there's a Rishus Harabim, make sure you put on a hat that has some kind of strap to secure it, or that will stay on very firmly on your head. Now this is a concern even Bisman Hazeh. Whether it's a shtreimel or a borsalino or a baseball cap, it doesn't matter. It's got to be something that if you know it's a windy day, you're not allowed to walk outside on a windy day when your hat can really very easily fly off.
That's why you need a tefach.
No, so I think the Gemara is falling off that teretz. The Gemara is actually rejecting that teretz. The issue is not an oyel. The issue is not an oyel here. The issue is it going to fly off or not? It's got nothing to do with how wide the brim is. Next Mishnah. Machzirin sir atachton b'mikdash avalo b'medina v'ha'elyon kan v'kan aser. So the Tanakama says, here we're talking about a door that becomes unhinged. Now it's important to realize that the doors that had hinges, there were not side hinges like you and I have today. There was a hinge on top and a hinge on the bottom. And the hinges were not hinges like we build that are like an accordion hinge, but they were built just basically like, a swivel door, like you have a swivel door for your, that goes into your kitchen sometimes. So there's 2 pegs protruding from the door, one on top, one on bottom. And there are 2 holes, one in the top of the door frame, one in the bottom of the door frame, and that's how the door stays hinged, or connected to the frame. What happens if it becomes unhinged, right? What if one of the pegs comes out? So the Mishnah says that if the bottom hinge comes out and the top hinge is still connected, so that's less of a problem of boina because it's still mostly connected. You're just trying to get it back in to realign it, so that's okay. Avalo b'medina. You can only do that in the Beis Hamikdash. You can't do that outside because there's a rabbinic prohibition that it looks like bona. But if it's the elyon, but not only the bottom hinges come out, but even the top hinges come out. So then you can't even do that in the Beis HaMikdash because then there's mamash and isser of boina midioraisa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ha'elyon b'mikdash v'hatachton b'medina. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He's more lenient. He says, even if the top one comes out, you're allowed to return it. He says, like, 1 second. Where's the Mishnah over here? All right. Okay. So Rashi doesn't say, but Rabbi Yehuda apparently holds that it's not a problem of bonus. So in the Beis HaMikdash, even returning the top hinge is okay. And outside the Beis HaMikdash, there's going to be a rabbinic prohibition of putting the top hinge back in, but the bottom hinge is going to be okay. Okay, now here, as will become clear in the Mishnah, the Gemara in just a moment, we're talking about a door that is not necessarily attached to a building, but rather it's attached to a cabinet, which is a kli. And there's more of a reason to be makel by a kli, as we'll see momentarily. The Gemara now says, Tana Rabbanan, Tzir dela shida v'teva umigdal. So if you have the hinge of a door that is the door for a cabinet or some kind of drawer, bureau or something like that, so then b'mikdash machzirin b'medina doichikin. That in the Beis HaMikdash, if the hinge completely comes out, you're allowed to return it in the Beis HaMikdash only, but not outside the Beis HaMikdash. And b'medina, and if outside the Beis HaMikdash, the only time you're allowed to return a hinge is if it's only partially out, and it just needs to be pushed in to be realigned. But it's still mostly connected to the frame structure. That's only by the bottom hinge. The ha'elyon kan v'kan lo yachzir, and the top hinge, both in the Beis HaMikdash and outside the Beis HaMikdash, you're not allowed to put it back. You're not allowed to put it back. Now, Rashi has an interesting way of learning the next line of the Gemara. The next line of the Gemara is not talking anymore about the top hinge. The part about the top hinge is a prohibition simply because you're doing an act of bona, so therefore there's an Isser Deoraisa. The next statement of Gezerah Shema Yiska, that we make a decree, is going back on why in the Medina you're not allowed to restore the bottom hinge when it became totally out. Why are you not allowed to restore the bottom hinge when it came totally out? Gezerah Shema Yiska, because we're worried that even though right now it's not really an act of bona, but you may be tempted to use a kli and really fix the item, and which would constitute a malacha deoraisa if you used actual tools in order to fix this cabinet and make sure that it's working again. V'im taka chayev chatas, and if you do that, then you're going to have to bring a korban chatas for doing an act of tikkun kli. And shel bor v'shel dus v'shel yatzia lo yachzir v'im hechzer chayev chatas. And similarly, it certainly goes without saying that if you're fixing a door that is part of a structure that is attached to the ground, not like a bureau or a cabinet, but here we're talking about a door that's like a trap door, or like a door to a cellar, or a door to a cave, or a pit, or a shed, then you're certainly not allowed to reattach that door. And if you do reattach that door by rehinging it, attaching it to its hinges, then you're going to have to bring a korban chatas. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Machzirin ritiya b'mikdash avalo b'medina im batechila kan v'kan aser. The Mishnah says that you're allowed to restore or return a bandage on your hand or on your foot or whatever it is in the Beis HaMikdash, but you're not allowed to do that outside the Beis HaMikdash. So let me just explain the way I understand it so far. The bandage that we're dealing with seems to me like there's some ointment or salve on the bandage. And the problem that you have is that by putting on a bandage on Shabbos, you're doing the malacha of mimareach, you're smearing an ointment on your skin. So the thing is that everyone holds that you're not allowed to actually apply a bandage in the Beis HaMikdash, but if a Kohen, in the course of needing to do the avoda, had to remove his bandage, because there cannot be any chatzitza, any separation between your hand and the avoda, so he needed to remove the bandage off of his hand, and now he wants to put it back on, so we allow him to do that, because if we wouldn't allow him to return it to his hand, he would never take it off in the first place. So we allow him to put it back in the Beis HaMikdash, abalo b'medina. But if you took off a bandage outside the Beis HaMikdash, we don't allow you to put it back on. And im batchila kan v'kan aser. And if this is the first time you want to apply a bandage for the first time on Shabbos, then everyone holds that would be asur even in the Beis HaMikdash, because of the concern of doing a malacha of mimareach. And like
with the salve.
it seems to me like it's a salve.
If you put on a bandage without a salve.
It seems to me, I mean, that's the only way I was able to understand this Gemara. There must be some kind of ointment or salve that's smearing. Unless the type of bandage in the times of the Gemara was very different from ours and I'm just not familiar with it. But just putting on an ace bandage, something like that, there's no problem at all.
Or if it was a liquid you're applying, that would make a difference?
If it's purely a liquid, then it would not make a difference. Here we're talking about something that's very, very viscous, like a cream or an ointment. Now the Gemara now says, Tanu Rabbanan Ritiya Shapir Shamei Al Gabe Maka Machzirin B'Shabbos, that if you have a bandage that fell off a wound, you're allowed to put it back on Shabbos. That's the Tanakama. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer Huchla Kolamata Doich Kolamalu Lamala Doich Kolamata. Rabbi Yehuda is more machmer over here. He disagrees. He says it's only that if it slips downwards or slips upwards, you're allowed to reposition it over the wound, but you can't. If it mamish falls off, you can't put it back on. And you're also allowed to lechatchila slide the bandage down to expose the wound, to give it some air, and to clean it, and you're allowed to do, and then put it back in place. But the thing that you're not allowed to do is wipe down the bandage itself, which contains this salve material, because then you're doing an act of smearing on Shabbos. And if you do smear, you have to bring a carbon chatus, because you've done a malacha. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel halacha ka Rebbe Yehuda. And Shmuel says the halacha is like Rebbe Yehuda, that we're machmir, that if it falls off, you're not allowed to put it back on. Amar Rav Chizda lo shanu ela shapir shal gabe kli, aval pir shal gabe karka divrei kol aser. So Rav Chizda wants to clarify further, and he says the only time there's even a machlokes between Rebbe Yehuda and the Chachamim as to whether you can restore a bandage that fell off or not is if it fell on top of a utensil, not on the ground. But if it fell on the ground, that even the Chachamim agree that it's usher to restore it, because it's like putting it on for the first time. So Omar Mar Baravashi Havakaimna Kamei Abba Nafuleya Beisadja V'Kama Hadrle. So I once had a Maisa where I was standing before my father Ravashi, and he had a bandage on. It fell off. It fell onto his pillow, and he put it back on Shabbos. So Amina Leilo Savar Lomar Laha de Amar Rav Chizda Machloike Shapir Shel Gabi Kliabal Pir Shel Gabi Karka Aser the Amar Shmuel Halacha Kareb Yehuda. 1 second, I said to him, Father, I said, don't you realize that we paskin like Rebbe Yehuda? That the only time there's a machlokas between the Chacham and Rebbe Yehuda is only when it falls off and lands on a kli. When it falls off and lands on the ground, everyone holds that's aser. And when it falls on a kli, there we paskin like Rebbe Yehuda, who says that it's aser also. But so, Father, by what right did you have to put the bandage back on your hand? So Amar Le lo shamiali. So Rav Ashi said, I never heard that. Kolomar lo severely, meaning I don't hold that way. I hold that Rabbi Yehuda is only machmir if it falls on the ground. But if it falls on a kli, then Rabbi Yehuda would say that it's okay to restore it to your wound. Finally, let's do the next Mishnah. Koshrin nima b'mikdash avalo b'medina v'imbatechila kan v'kan aser. Here we're talking about stringing a musical instrument like a harp or a guitar or a violin. Rabbi Suddenly needs to know these things because he'll be playing music. You're not a Levi, are you?
Not to
know. All right. But if you're a Levi or you're a musician, you need to know these things, right? You'll teach the Levium. So anyway, are you allowed to restring a musical instrument on Shabbos? If the string breaks on Shabbos, are you allowed to restring it? So in the Beis HaMikdash, yes, but outside the Beis HaMikdash, no. And if before Shabbos the instrument was not strung, and you want to string it for the first time, meaning because it was unstrung even before Shabbos, then even the Beis HaMikdash we don't allow you to do that, and we'll see why in just a moment.
It wasn't high strung.
It wasn't high strung, right? Or a minhu. So the Gemara raises a contradiction. Nimas kinor shenifsaka lo hayakoshra ela onva. There's a brisa that says that if a string broke on the harp in the Beis HaMikdash, we didn't allow you to tie the string, when we say koshrin, all that means, koshrin means not that you can actually restring it, but koshrin means that you tie the string. You tie it when it snaps, and you just tie it up. That's what the Mishnah says is okay. Here the brisa says you're not even allowed to do that, but you can only tie a bow. You can't tie a permanent knot. So how do you reconcile the contradiction? Lo kasha harabanan v'haRebbi Eliezer. The answer is that it's a machlokas the Chachamim and Rebbe Eliezer, because Rebbe Eliezer says, if you remember Rebbe Eliezer de Mila in Masechah Shabbos, we learned that when it comes to bris milah, Rebbe Eliezer permits you to do malachos to prepare for the bris. Like he says, you can even start a fire to forge the metal that will be used for the bris milah knife, right? So far he goes. So therefore, he says also, even though creating a musical instrument on Shabbos is not the mitzvah is playing it, but we allow you to do malacha in order to prepare yourself to play the musical instrument, just like we allow you to do malacha in order to prepare yourself for doing the bris. So the Rabbi Eliezer, Domer Machshirei Mitzvah Doichenes HaShabbos Kosher. Therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's going to be okay to tie the knot on Shabbos to enable you to play the musical instrument. The Rabbanan Domri Ein Dochin Onva. But according to the Chachamim who say that you're not allowed to do Machshirei Mila, or Machshirei Mitzvah, I should say, on Shabbos, therefore you can only make a bow because it's not the actual mitzvah itself, is not to have a string, it's to play the music.
Tensioning it while they're playing, because it goes out of tune.
One second, we're going to talk about tensioning in just a second. So the Gemara now says, I Rebbe Eliezer afilu lechatchila nami. So the Gemara says, how can you tell me this is going according to Rebbe Eliezer? According to Rebbe Eliezer, not only is it permitted to fix a string that breaks, but it should be permitted even if the whole thing was completely broken before Shabbos. You should still be allowed to do it on Shabbos. How come the Mishnah says that lichatchila you're not allowed to do it, only if it breaks on Shabbos? According to Rebbe Eliezer, even if you had the opportunity to do it before Shabbos, it's mutter. So our Mishnah can't be like Rebbe Eliezer. Ela lo kasha haRebbe Yehuda v'haRabbanan. The answer is the Gemara. No, it's a machlokas Rebbe Yehuda and the Rabbanan. That what? The Rebbe Yehuda. So what does Rebbe Yehuda say? Rebbe Yehuda says, if you remember, we learned before. He says there's no difference between making a knot and making a bow. They're both the malacha of kosher. So according to Rebbe Yehuda, it makes no difference whether you make a knot or a bow. There's no advantage of making a bow over a knot. They're both a malacha. So if we allow you to make a bow, we also allow you to make a knot. And that's why our Mishnah says, knock yourself out and make a knot, because it makes no difference. The Chachamim disagree and they say, no, a bow is not the malacha of kosher, and therefore, since you're not allowed to do a malacha in order to fix the instrument, you're better off making a bow. So the Gemara says, "Rebbe Yehuda liba deman." So wait a second, who is Rebbe Yehuda going according to? Ia liba de Rebbe Eliezer kamar afilu lichatchila nami. The only thing you have to conclude is that Rebbe Yehuda must subscribe to Rebbe Eliezer Shita, who says that machshirei mitzvah doiche Shabbos. You're back to square one. If Rebbe Yehuda is subscribing to Rebbe Eliezer, so then our Mishnah is problematic, because then it should tell me that even lechatchila, when the string was broken even before Shabbos, I'm allowed to tie it on Shabbos. And yet our Mishnah says, no, you can only tie it if it breaks on Shabbos. So ela lo kasha, so we have to come to another machlokas. Ha-Reb Shimon, ha-Rabbanan. There's a machlokas between Reb Shimon and the Rabbanan regarding the following case. The Tanya, and this is really where we find this position where we only allow you to tie it if it breaks on Shabbos, but if it breaks before Shabbos, we don't allow you to tie it. Ben Levi shenifsek halonima bekinor, that if a Levi has his harp string break on Shabbos, then koshra. Then you're allowed to tie it, and that's the sheet of the Chachamim, and that's the sheet of our Mishnah, who say that only if it breaks on Shabbos are you allowed to tie it, meaning that we do allow you to do machshirei mitzvah on Shabbos, but only if you didn't have the opportunity to do it before Shabbos, because if something unexpected happens. Reb Shimon Omer Onva, and Reb Shimon is the Brisa. Reb Shimon says that you're only allowed to make a bow because it's machshirei mitzvah. Now here we get to the issue of restringing it completely. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Af hi ena mashmas es hakol. Whether you make a knot or whether you make a bow, that's not going to produce a good sound. You need the Levium to produce, for you audiophiles, you need them to produce a good sound, right? And by either tie, and Rabbi subtly can confirm this, you try to tie a string on a violin or on a cello or on a guitar, it's not going to work as well. It's not going to sound as good, right? So therefore, what you got to do is ela mishalshel milamata v'korich milamala, or mishalshel milamala v'korich milamata. Even in the times of the Gemara, they had musical instruments which had a tightener. What is that called?
Fine tuner.
A fine tuner. It had a fine tuner. And so the fine tuner, what happens if a string on your guitar breaks? So what you do is you discard the bottom part, and you pull out the remainder of the string that's wound around this roller, right? And then you restring it by attaching it to the bottom. And in the times...
The guitar is different than the string instrument. The string instruments have one on the bottom and one on the top. There's a peg.
Oh, okay.
Guitar only has only a peg. So the guitar only attaches with one loop at the bottom. The strings go around the fine tuner and on top.
Got it. Very good. You see, now here the Gemara is talking about two different kinds of instruments. One is where the tuner is on the bottom and the peg is on top.
Right.
And one is where the tuner is on top and the peg is on the bottom. In either case, you discard the part that can no longer be, of the string that no longer be used. You pull out the longer length that you need from the roller, right? And then you tie it to whichever side the peg is on. Mm-hmm. And that, he says, is the only option. He says, because look, we allow you to do machshirei mitzvah on Shabbos when there's no brera, and since the other things are not going to produce a good sound, this is your best option. The Chachamim disagree, and they says that doing an act of kosher, he says is a lesser of two evils, I guess, is supposedly what you say, right? He says because the Chachamim feel that by allowing you to restring it in the way that Reb Shimon ben Elazar is describing, you're going to come to do this lechatchila on Shabbos. So to avoid that, we only allow you to tie. We tell you minimize the remedy. Okay, so the Gemara now says, the Iboy is saying, I'll give you another answer. How do you reconcile the Mishnah and the Brisa? The Mishnah which says kosher and the Brisa which says you can only do a bow is Hava HaRabbanan. Both go like the Rabbanan who say that you're allowed to do machshirei mitzvah on Shabbos when there's no other option. V'lo kasher kan be'emtza kan min hatzad. But the difference is that when the string breaks in the middle, the only way to produce a half-decent sound is by making a knot. But when the string breaks at either end of the instrument, then you can make a bow and still get a good sound. And that's why there's a difference between the Mishnah and the Brisa. And finally, we can give another answer, is that there's a machlokes between the Mishnah and the Brisa when the string breaks in the center. The Chachamim hold of our Mishnah that it's okay, go ahead and tie it. And the opinion of the Brisa is no, because if we allow you to tie it when it breaks in the center, you may come to make a knot when it breaks at either end of the instrument, and that we don't want you to do because it's not necessary, and therefore we never let you make a knot on the string. You have a wonderful day. Have a musical day.